welcome back to the Leadership Institute studios. I'm Kyle Bechet, Communications Manager here at the Leadership Institute, and your host for today's webinar. Our topic for today will be fundamentals for getting out the vote. We're going to take you from day one of your campaign to election day in order to ensure that you have everything you need to know in order to get out the vote and win your election. Joining us to talk about this topic is Stephen Sutton, the Vice President of Development here at the Leadership Institute and a campaign veteran who has worked on the Hill and on many campaigns. Steve, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Before we get into today's topic, however, I would like to remind you, as always, this webinar is live and you can have your questions asked and answered on air. To have your questions asked, email us at live@leadershipinstitute.org. Also, you can join in the conversation today by using the hashtag LIWebinar. With that, thank you all again for joining us. And Steve, tell us about getting out the vote and everything. Why is it important to your campaign, and what do we need to know about it?
Well, it's important to a campaign because you want to make sure that your voters, your supporters actually vote. There are many examples where candidates have lost elections by a handful of votes. A congressional candidate once lost by 20 some odd votes in Connecticut. So it matters. The problem with getting out the vote is you won't know if it matters until the day after the election. If you're winning by 12 points or losing by 30 points, then getting out the vote probably isn't going to make much of a difference. But you won't know that until the day after. And so you've got to do it. There are many estimates that a good, solid get out the vote program can help you by between 2 to 4 percentage points. And your lack of doing it and the other side doing it can make a difference of 4 to 8 points. And so in a close election, you do not want to lose by 4 votes and have not done getting out the vote. So there's different ways to do it, and we're going to talk about some of the important aspects to it. But as in all things, it starts before the actual operation, well before Election Day.
Right. So yeah, you mentioned that you got to start. Obviously got to start from somewhere. Planning is everything in campaigns. We all know that. So where do you start, and when? More importantly, when do you start?
Well, you need to develop your plan as soon as possible. There's even if your get out the vote program doesn't start till 60 days before or whatever. We'll talk about the details of that. You should still be planning for it from day one. When you write your campaign plan, all campaigns should have a plan. There should be a component of your plan that is getting out the vote. Now, getting out the vote encompasses all aspects of the campaign. So it's not an isolated day of the election operation. It's not going to be just on election day, this is what you do. Even the infamous 72 hours before the election, you kick in your get out the vote plan. Even that's too limiting, particularly since so many voters now vote early. In some states, there is no election day get out the vote plan because everyone's voting early. I think the national average is, I think you mentioned, about 1/3 of the vote is early, absentee and early voting. And obviously that's an average. In some states it's 100% now. In other states it's considerably less. But you have to know what the rules are in your area and act accordingly. So you should start on day one when you're planning your campaign. Understand that it's all focused on getting to election day or when people vote, and then the plan to get out that vote. So it should start, the planning starts right away.
So in that planning process, are you looking at, you said everything, so what are the big roles? Voting totals, messaging to certain groups?
Right. All those things have to be done. What you're doing with getting out the vote is you're identifying your voters and then getting them to the polls. A lot of times people think it's getting them to the polls. You have to identify them first. So the initial stages are, you should be doing your targeting, precinct by precinct, with vote goals that you can give to precinct chairman and say, we need you to get 223 votes out of your precinct. And once you have that as the goal, it's very measurable. So you have somebody in charge, you have to train people what to do, and then you begin the process of identifying your voters. Now, early on, particularly at a lower level, let's assume this is not a $1 million campaign for Congress or higher, that it's a state rep or lower, city council seat, for example. You've got to figure out who your voters are. The undecided vote 6 months out will be 80%. They haven't heard of you. And keep in mind, many of these races will be nonpartisan. Mm-hmm. And so you've got to figure out how many votes that you need, and then what are we going to do to convince people? If you start identifying your voters too soon, you'll be wasting a lot of time. If you have phone banks on day one, who are you supporting? You will soon find out 80% are undecided. And so that's not what the phone bank should be doing. The phone bank should be persuading people. And so, particularly when it's 80%, you can assume everyone needs to be persuaded. And so maybe you do call 100 or 1,000 people, and once you get that data in, phoning is great because you'll know immediately. Mm-hmm. You have results that night. By the next day, you have a plan. This didn't work, this did work. And so for the undecided voters, obviously if someone supports you, you put them into the get out the vote queue as someone that you want to bring out to vote. But the undecideds, what is the mechanism you're going to use to persuade them? And that's what the whole campaign is about, so that's why it encompasses every aspect of your campaign. Are you going to contact them? How are you going to contact them? When are you going to contact them? How frequently? And then on what messages? So although it's not part of getting out the vote, asking people and finding out what's most important to them is part of getting out the vote. It's the very, very prelude to doing that.
You mentioned something in there, and I just want to clarify it a bit. You talked about persuading voters early on. So does that mean you're calling up people and saying, hey, my opponent wants to raise dog licensing fees, or, I want to do X, Y, or Z? Is that exactly what kind of thing,
Right, but the more personal you can make the contact based on what is important to them, the more successful you'll be to persuade them. So that suggests an initial step to find out what's important to them. Now, some campaigns don't have the resources, and then you just kind of go generic. So what's the number one issue? It's usually the economy, and within that subset of or overall economy, what's the subset? Maybe it's jobs. It's going to be some aspect of the economy. It might be taxes related to the economy. And so you may have to make some assumptions. But this is the decisions that a campaign needs to make, which then sets up what you're going to do. And one of the most important things about getting out the vote is finding out what other campaigns are going to do.
You're getting into a topic that just want to that we definitely need to talk about today. Is obviously campaigns are not in a vacuum.
Right.
How do you work with other campaigns in this get out the vote effort?
Ideally, there's always we try to teach the utopia. This is the book method. This is what you should do.
Right.
And then the reality. So let's go through that. Ideally, you want to be able to get together with other campaigns of either party and find out what they are doing. And then make a decision as to who gets turned out or not. For example, you're running for state senate. And you're going to identify voters. And these other campaigns, the presidential campaign is identifying voters. There's a Senate race, maybe a governor's race, and a congressional race, all above you. Well, what if the person is going to vote for your party's presidential candidate and governor and senator, but not for Congress and not for you? Well, you don't want them turned out. But 3 of the 5 campaigns do want them turned out. So those will be the tough decisions that will have to be made. Just make sure you're communicating with the other campaigns. It's not more likely, but the dilemma for your campaign, this voter is voting for the other party for president and Senate and Congress. But they're voting for you for state senate. You want them turned out. Nobody else in that meeting wants them turned out. So campaigns will come to some agreement. Typically, the party says, we're just turning out partisans who are going to vote straight ticket. Well, that's good to know, so you don't have to worry about those people. You have to rely on the party, but you have limited resources. So the party's turning out straight ticket voters. Maybe the presidential campaign is going to turn out people who they agree are 3 out of 4, if there's 4 races that are in the meeting. Okay, if you're part of the 3, great, you don't have to worry about them. And so you just work down the line and figure out what are other campaigns going to do. And typically in getting out the vote, that is something where you divide the work. There'll be disagreements. But then you can focus on the person who's voting for you, but not voting for anyone at the top of the ticket. Your campaign wants to turn that person out, and you should focus on that person, because that's your job, to get your person elected. And so it will allow your campaign, the farther down ballot it is, to turn out people who are just voting for you. So you can make it very specific to your campaign, and that's where you find the swing voters or the ticket splitters who can really make a difference for your campaign. And the farther down ballot it is, the greater the challenge, and you'll have to go it alone, because at some point you'll be turning out people who are voting for the other side of the ticket in the 7 races ahead of you,
right.
But they really like your guy. So they're partisans of the left,
right.
But they know your guy, so they're going to vote for him. Well, you want them to turn out. So that's the decisions you have to make within the campaign. And you need to make those decisions before the 72-hour window. So this is part of the organization phase.
So this is part of like the pre-campaign where you're meeting with all the other campaigns in the area and things like that.
Right.
Now this all seems like a very tough conversation to have with campaigns.
Sure.
Well,
you have to count. You have to count the liars in that meeting. And then you have to count the damn liars, because people, we won't turn them out, don't worry, and then they will. Or just communicate and be open and honest to the extent that you can.
Right. Now, what about if you are a candidate on either side, no matter what party you are, and the party's not that effective, and you know that going into it?
Well, then the campaigns have to pick up the ball. You should know if the party is effective, how effective they've been from previous campaigns. What did they do a year ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago? This is a presidential year, it's different. Turnout will be higher, but will it be high enough? And part of getting out the vote and absentee ballots and absentee voting and early voting is registering voters. Okay, if I were giving advice to the Donald Trump campaign, they're not calling me, I would have heavy investment in registering voters. I think that part of the model that they are probably thinking of is expanding the electorate. Well, that requires the effort of registering people. You can just let it happen, and there will be people who change party to vote in primaries and people who come out. But if the numbers are true, and more people have voted in the Republican primary this year than ever before, it's still not enough. You want to always be doing more. So they should sit down and say, what do we need to do? And then split the work between different campaigns. For example, if you're running for city council, well, in that city, you are going to register voters, and then all the other campaigns don't have to worry about it. You'll be registering voters, and you'll really make an effort to get out the vote. And then the other campaigns can focus on other areas. So it really is a team effort. So the stronger the team, the better the effort.
And I think you saw that work very well for the Democrats in 2008 and 2012 with their registering the vote effort. Something that I think, political technology is neutral. Everyone should pick up on that.
Well, and I think it helped Republicans in 2010 and 2014, whether people were actively engaged in registering people to vote or people just simply did. That's the thing, but we have to pay attention to that. So we need to be dedicating some resources to registering voters.
Right. So we have everything organized. We have
magic wand time.
We've figured out the plan.
Right.
We've talked to all the other campaigns in our area. What's next? What are
next
the next steps
is persuading and identifying the voters. At some point, maybe it's Labor Day, but at some point you should see people deciding. As you call them on the phone, there are fewer and fewer undecideds. The first time you try your phone banks in May and June, 80% undecided. But then that starts to narrow. And you want to persuade the undecideds, and you want to get out the vote of your people. And so as the undecideds shrink, you're persuading fewer and fewer people, and you are focusing more resources on getting the other people out to vote, voting early, absentee, or on election day. And so it's a combination. You're persuading as well as identifying, but the whole purpose is to identify your voter and make sure they vote, whether early, absentee, or on election day. And that is the focus. Now, how do you do that? Well, your persuasion is by all the techniques that you would imagine. It's direct mail and television and emails, telephone and door-to-door are great ways, because when you're actually engaged in talking to the voter, that's when you can begin to identify what will motivate them. And there's been a great effort, particularly by the left, but the right's caught up a bit, on door-to-door canvassing, where you're not asking them to vote for your person right away. What issue is most important to you this election cycle? And they may say immigration. They may say taxes. They may say whatever they say, and then you can focus your voter persuasion on those issues. I mean, how effective is it for a volunteer to show up at someone's door? We're here to listen. We'd like to know, I'm working with Joe Schmedlock for City Council. What's the most important issue to you? Then they're going to say something. In the old days, we had the clipboards. You'd write it down, take it back to headquarters, somebody would type it in. Now it's just
put it in on an app.
and it goes up to a satellite somewhere, if they haven't been shot out of the sky yet, and zap. So the next day, you could have 25 letters that go out from the candidate saying, "Dear Mr. Schmedlock, I understand you spoke with one of my volunteers yesterday." I mean, you can make it that person, yesterday. And your primary concern is school choice. Enclosed is my position paper on that, which I hope you'll have a chance to read. If you have any questions, call me.
Right.
And now when somebody calls up that voter, you're much more likely for them to say, "Wow, I'm just impressed with your operation. If you have that kind of operation running for city council, I'd like you on the..." Now suddenly they're voting for you. Yeah, I think I will vote for the guy. And that's how you begin that process.
Right.
And getting to the final
Right.
push to get them to vote, which is a pretty generic thing. You're knocking on doors and calling them up, you know.
So persuading voters, and then we get to the actual, do you plan to vote? Are you coming to the polls? Get to the polls and vote for me,
Right.
type stuff.
Right.
So what does that all entail?
Well, it depends, again, what your resources are. First and foremost, you want enough volunteers engaged on election day activities and getting out the vote to pull it off. So you have to, that should have been in your plan. Your plan will fall apart once you engage with the other side. But you'll need a certain number of volunteers to call people to remind them. And you cannot call them too much. Now, certainly you can, but people have brains and they're not going to call every second. The more frequently you remind someone to vote, the more likely they're going to vote. And so you have an aggressive plan to get people to vote for your candidate. And that requires an organization. Volunteers making phone calls. If you're on election day, it's perhaps taking people to the polls. You could even do daycare. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do depending upon where you live and what you feel the need might be. So you could do daycare for people so that they could vote. And then, of course, you have to add early voting and absentee voting to that model. When do people historically make their decision? There's a lot of information out there. If somebody votes absentee every 4 years, and they've done that 5 times in a row, it's likely there's a reason, and they have a propensity. So use that data and figure that out. So you need volunteers. Sometimes we ignore on our side, you need an election day team of attorneys. There may be problems at the polls. The left's contention that there's no voter fraud in America is absurd. There's constant voter fraud. It's frequently not reported. It's definitely not prosecuted. Because after the election, both sides kind of say, But when it matters, it really matters.
So is that because, a lot of the people probably tuning in today are working on local campaigns, might not have the resources to get one of those high-priced DC attorneys?
Point. Well, there'll be volunteer attorneys,
Okay.
but again, what are the other campaigns doing? You can have a team of attorneys, and if they're available to you, should you have a problem, then that's okay. But just make sure they're available. But there will be voter fraud. It's guaranteed. And sometimes it takes the form of people voting in multiple locations. Sometimes it's organized. Same-day registration. If your state has same-day registration, you're in for it.
Is that something that your state parties can help you with? For the
They should. They should.
Okay.
But sometimes they won't.
It depends on.
When I worked for Congressman Klein in Minnesota, same-day registration, it was a huge problem. And we actually busted a same-day registration voter fraud ring that was going on. It was just factually, it was happening. And we stopped it in our district. Now, did the state party stop it in the Twin Cities? I hope they did. But I would say it's not a stretch to say we have Obamacare today because of voter fraud. And that's because the 60th seat was Al Franken, who won a very close race that went to a recount. And with same-day registration, no one can convince me that that didn't cost Norm Coleman the election. And now, maybe the state party was aggressive and stopped all the voter fraud early in the day, and maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm right.
Well,
We'll leave
that one where it is.
Saying.
We'll leave that one where it is. You mentioned
But the left actually would have bus loads or van loads of people that would go from one precinct to the next and register to vote at that precinct, and would do that all day long. And we stopped them. And in order to vote, you need someone to vouch for you. You have to, or you can bring a bill from home. But some people don't have bills from home, I guess, to show that they live there. So all you needed was a neighbor to vouch for you. And that sounds great until there's someone in the parking lot with a little sign that says voucher, meaning they're the voucher person. And then the people would go and pick the voucher person, and the voucher person would stand there, and every one of the 25 people on the van would be vouched for by this person, and then and that person was in that precinct, and then they get on the van and go to the next precinct to the next voucher person. That is organized voter fraud. That's what was happening. We stopped it very quickly.
Right.
But if that had gone on all day, you could do the math. Those people would have been able to vote 6, 8 times. Times
so
20 people, that's 160 people.
So the moral of it is be ready for anything and have election.
Sure, and we knew that because historically that's what had been done before. I mean, and if you should have your ear to the ground and know what's happening. And so we heard rumors that was going to happen. It had happened before, so we were just vigilant, and we said, and we trained the lawyers, and then we trained our poll workers. Don't just sit in the poll inside. Go outside, see what's going on. And somebody said, there's a guy out here with a sign that says voucher. And we sent the lawyers over, and we stopped it.
Interesting.
And I wanted to prosecute, but the congressman wins. He doesn't want to seem petty, so he's like, we'll just let it go. So.
You mentioned a little while ago using the data when you talk to voters. Obviously, you're not going to talk to the same voter who votes for different reasons, or maybe if there's somebody comes to your door and says, do you plan to vote?
Right.
Well, that seems like kind of a stupid question to ask somebody like you.
And that happened.
And I know you have a story about this, so why don't you tell your story?
Well, in Virginia, they have off-year elections, meaning for state delegates. It's a Commonwealth, so they're delegates instead of state reps. And state senate, those occur in the odd-numbered years. And one day I get a knock on my door, and it's 2 volunteers from the person running for delegate, which is rare. And they knocked on my door, and we're going door to door today on behalf of candidate Schmedlock, and we were wondering, will you be voting this year? And I gave them an A+ for effort, and then I informed them, I vote in every election, and in Virginia, it's there's no voter, there's no party registration. You on election day in the primary, you designate which party you want to be that day and vote in them. And I have voted in every Republican primary for 20 years. And I said, I got to ask you, what are you doing at my door? Wasting your time. I'm glad that you're knocking on doors, but on the other hand, I'm not. And they said, well, we're just doing this, and we want to know if you would want to get out the vote for Republicans and want to make sure. And I'm like, that's not the best use of your time, because I'm voting. Mm-hmm. And I'm voting for your guy, clearly, as is my wife, so kind of wasting your time. It's not, thanks for coming by. Would you like a soft drink? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but so it was a campaign, at least doing the right. They clearly had a get out the vote program, an identification program, but they were clearly wasting resources on me.
What would have been a better way to come after a voter like you?
Well, they could have called, I suppose, but we don't answer our phone. But they could just, you know what? They should just know we are voting, no matter what. And the state party doesn't even have to call us, but at least that's where it should have been. The local party should have been, look, the partisan Republicans we are going to take care of. And by the way, instead of just asking us to vote, they should ask us to put a yard sign out, which no one has ever, well, I shouldn't say ever done. And they should ask us to donate, which no one's ever done. Yeah, you could actually knock on people's door and ask for money. We notice from the voter records that you are a frequent Republican voter. Will you be voting this time? Would you like to donate to our campaign? And had they asked me that, I probably would have. So now my house is a marked house. I'll have people from campaigning in Maryland who will come over to Virginia and say, I hear you donate to Republican candidates.
There you go.
Would you like to buy a set of encyclopedias as well?
So you've been involved with a lot of get out the vote efforts in your time.
Sure.
Tell us some of your best success stories and what lessons people can learn from it.
Well, I was involved in a special election in Tennessee, and it was a nonpartisan race. But that was a huge success because we determined, quick example, actually, again, this actually happened on election day, special election for city council, which is a nonpartisan race. On election day, the candidate's wife calls me up and says, Steve, you messed up. We don't have poll workers, and the other side has poll workers. And I said, no, I didn't mess up. I said, let me ask you something. And they had the lounge chairs that they were sitting in. They had coffee because it was in the winter. They had donuts, and we had nothing. She says, we got to get people to the poll. I said, hang on a second. I said, let me ask you a question. Who'd you vote for? She said, I voted for my husband. I said, exactly. Is anyone showing up today undecided? Well, it's a special election. No. It's just for city council. I said, exactly. I said, so she goes, what should I tell? I said, all our volunteers are on the phones. We weren't out there in the cold. We were on the phones calling our supporters because we identified them. We didn't need to be at the polls handing out literature. So they used a static model and didn't consider what this election was. So Judy said, well, the volunteers are asking. They think we've made a big mistake. What should I tell them? I said, tell them to eat their donuts and drink their coffee and vote for our guy. Okay, and we won the election 70-30. And this was a swing district. It was a 50-50 situation, and we won 70-30 because we were doing it the right way, and we were staying warm because nobody. So you have to look at every situation. Now, had there been people up ballot on top of us, yeah, you need people at the polls for down ballot because of the drop off, and you want to remind them, keep voting all the way down to our guy.
So it was a vacuum election, so you really just don't have to worry about reminding other people that, oh, you might be here to vote for the governor, but also I'm running today.
Right. So I'm not saying never do that. Right. It's just you have to read what, and keep in mind with the other side, how much time they wasted in their lounge chairs out there in the cold. Vote for our guy, and people were like, I've already decided. So their guys are giving them the thumbs up. Our people, that's Tennessee, so they were not giving them a different finger. But in New York, they would have, so they're voting. There's no undecided voters in a special election for city council. So that was one great effort that we did. We did it the right way, and it really paid dividends. I mean, we really overperformed. That was crazy.
In the beginning, you also mentioned, the Connecticut race where they lost by 20. What are some of the failures you've seen? What are the reasons for failures?
Well, this is a sad story. A man ran for Congress and found out after the election he lost by 20 votes. They had a recount and it swelled to 27 or 40. But many of his campaign workers and volunteers didn't vote because they were so busy on election day getting out the vote. Well, wish you had that one back. You know, oh, if I had known it was going to be so close, I would have voted for you. Families, oh, we were on vacation, we would have voted absentee. It's the husband and the wife and 2 of our children. And you hear it over, and it just, you know, crushes the guy. He's hearing this over and over again, and quickly adding up to more than 40 votes. That's U.S. Congress. So you just have to be aggressive, and you have to cry wolf. You have to tell people, you've got to vote. Oh, it's in the bag. And this was an election that he should have won. It was a good year for Republicans, and they were winning all over the place, and he lost a very, very, very close election.
Right, and you see that, and I mean, it's not, that happens. I mean, you know, there's the famous story of, you know, in the 80s when Carter conceded too early when the Western polls were still open and things like that. So all of this plays probably a huge role in worrying about your get out the vote effort.
Even in Florida in 2000, because of the time zone difference, when the networks were declaring the rest of Florida done, and then undone, and then done, and then back and forth, the panhandle was an hour time zone difference. So people were driving in their cars and they hear that Bush is lost. If you're a Bush supporter, you go home. And so, you know, that's never considered when they're talking about what ifs. Well, what if they hadn't have called it early, and hundreds, if not thousands, of more Bush voters would have voted, and then it wouldn't have mattered as much. So you really got to tell people with desperation in your voice, you have to vote, because you never know till the day after.
Right, and the day after is too late to change it.
And those are the ones that rip at you forever. You know, it's the one, again, it's like a sporting event. It's the 1-point losses that just tear at you, not the 30-point blowouts.
What if I call the timeout? What if
I had sank that one of those 2 free throws, you know, earlier in the game? Now the game changes in its strategy, but nonetheless, you think of every missed shot, every thrown away ball, turnover. They're killers.
It all plays a role. We do have our first question from the audience today. So Gail would like to know, where's a good place for Republicans, conservative candidates, to go and register people to vote?
Great question. Every area is a little different. There has to be, well, I guess the first question you need to ask is, where are people not registered? There will be sections and neighborhoods of town that are new, new construction. The Welcome Wagon goes, and the League of Women Voters goes, and this is where they go, and businesses will go to, then somebody from the party should visit people. You can find out when the moving vans are delivering. You could tell all your volunteers, when you see a moving van unloading on the weekend, let the party know. And then within the next week, knock on the door. They have to register, even if it's re-registering from elsewhere in the area. So that's the first place you should look. If you're registering people in a supermarket, you want your table to be so blatantly Republican, because that was the question, that a liberal is not going to walk up to the table. So you want elephants on it and just blatantly Republican. But you have to. If a lefty registers, I believe most state laws, I think all of them, you have to register them and you have to turn it in. That's just the law. So, but if you make your table as blatantly conservative or Republican as possible, it's a self-filter. And typically, now you do it for a day. And if you're registering 8 out of 10 Democrats or lefties, then stop doing it after a day. But supermarkets, post offices, high traffic areas, libraries will do voter registrations, and maybe they'll let you do it, particularly if you're a nonpartisan group. And challenge them. The League of Women Voters gets to do it. They're not partisan, but they are liberal. And so if they're letting that group do it, then the Tea Party group should be allowed to do it. And when they say, no, the League of Women Voters does it, you should challenge that and make them say no to you. And then when they say no, you should challenge that. And you'll be successful. typically they'll be so scared of you, they'll cancel the League of Women Voters from doing it. So nobody gets to do it. But they've been doing it for 20 years. So look where other people are registering, and look for high traffic areas. I would start there.
Cool. What else do we need to know about Get Out the Vote?
I don't know. What else don't we know? I think we've talked about volunteers and identifying voters. We could talk a little bit about the pluses and minuses of phone banks versus door-to-door. I'm a huge fan of door-to-door. It's so personal. People will really tell you what's on their mind, what their top issues are, whether you have a shot with them or not. That's the best way to do it. So I would have, as aggressive as you can, a door-to-door plan.
Right.
Phones are nice because it's quicker.
So you should. So when you're talking about door-to-door efforts, you should have the majority of your volunteers working on a door-to-door effort.
I wouldn't say majority. I would see how it goes. If it's New York City, you're not getting into those apartments.
Right.
If it's a farm area and doors are a mile apart, maybe that's not what you want to do. It all depends. But there's got to be, in a small campaign, the 2 or 3 precincts that are crucial to you overperforming so that you can win a close election.
And where do you find out that information?
In your targeting.
Yeah.
When you're doing your targeting and your vote goals, you'll see which precincts. And you should know if you're talking to people who have done this before in other campaigns, you'll know where's the largest growth. You can register people door to door. Your door to door people should be prepared. And so if it's a Republican area, particularly nowadays, people are congregating around each other, and so it's just more likely. You could go door to door and register voters in a newer area, but just be prepared. Children are turning 18 all the time, and they don't register them at school, so maybe that's somebody that you can register. And not all young people are lefties. Many vote the way their parents will vote, particularly if they're still living at home. So those are some ideas of where to prioritize. But again, it's more effective to knock on key doors 2 or 3 times than every door once. I'm not a fan of that. You should be able to prioritize, and being organized and being able to prioritize to spend your resources wisely in the campaign in general is crucial. In getting out the vote, it's critical.
How many times should you talk to a voter?
As many times as it takes. If they're persuadable. And that's why if they're voting for the other person, if you don't need the vote to win, you just have to move on and not get into an argument.
Is there too much talking to that person?
Well, it depends. If you're spending 30 minutes at a door, probably. But if you're engaged in a real conversation, hopefully you have enough volunteers to keep that going, to sustain that, then maybe it's not such a bad thing to spend some time talking to a person so they know that you care. And I would have the candidate on the phone after people go door to door. So your door to door screeners these are the most persuadable people. Can you imagine a phone call from the candidate the next day? Now, this is candidate Schmedlock. I understand you spoke with one of my volunteers yesterday, and you had some questions about this issue and my position on the issue. I thought I'd give you a call to answer those questions. Holy cow! You may end up disagreeing, and they're going to vote for you just because you're responsive. So you can combine things like that. But it depends on what your candidate's comfortable doing and what they're best at. You want to use your limited resources as wisely as possible. And so everyone has to figure that out for themselves.
And then the other one you mentioned was phone banking. What?
Well, phones, you just can cover a lot more territory a lot more quickly, but it's less personal. And more people are not picking up their phones. So again, you have to try it and see how well it works. And then adjust as you move along. So you're testing everything. That's why there's the ideal, and then there's what's going to work in your area.
What the reality is.
Right.
Especially for that. We have another question coming in.
Great.
So this is from Gail, who wants to know, what is your suggestion for maximizing actually reaching voters? She's saying people won't this kind of gets at what we were just talking about. People won't answer their phones. Again, it probably comes down to testing, but maybe there's some other methods out there that people can use.
Every campaign's different. Every situation's different. Every organization has different strengths. Perhaps all your volunteers are 70 years old plus. Well, then maybe door-to-door is not the best way to go. But maybe you have a large young population that's of homeschoolers or some other young group. And then door-to-door is great. It just depends. What I will say, though, is ask those questions within the steering committee. How are we going to contact voters? It also depends upon your resources. Direct mail is great, but you have to pay for the postage, you have to pay for the printing. It's expensive. It's not the most expensive. You're focusing and targeting. Even phones, there's some cost to getting phone lines and doing all that. Door-to-door is the least expensive because it's all shoe leather. So do what you can do. Do as much of it as you can. Again, I've worked in campaigns where we said the candidate needs to walk this precinct 3 times because our model shows that we need to get 79% out of this precinct. And on election day, we got, I think 78% out of that precinct, and we defeated an incumbent state representative. So the candidate did not walk every precinct, but they walked that one 3 times. After a while, people are like, this is, you're the greatest thing in the world. You've knocked on my door 3 times. So what are your resources? Is the candidate a happy door-to-door warrior? Or are they petrified? Will they make phone calls, or are they scared of that? So work with what you have. Figure out what your assets are, maximize those assets. But because every medium has pros and cons, pluses and minuses.
Right. Another question from our audience.
If this is Gail again.
This time it's Chrissy. So
okay, it's Gail saying she's Chrissy.
Exactly.
All right.
Change her email address. She wants. So Chrissy wants to know, what do you do if you're living in a blue area? What does your get out the vote strategy look like?
Another great question. Is your race winnable or not? If it's I grew up in the Bronx in New York. If it's the Bronx, you're not going to win. But do other candidates want you to rifle shot your precincts and your area to try to help the rest of the ticket? Well, that's a strategy. Again, you've got to talk to the other campaigns and find out what is the strategy, because that could be very effective. You're going to get a lot more no's and doors slammed in your face than otherwise. But even within a blue area, there are going to be some precincts that are more or less blue than others. If it's a blue area and the red portions are, say, only 38%, it's not 38% in every precinct. Some precincts will be 36, some precincts will be 32, and other precincts will be 45, and there may even be some precincts that are 52. So prioritize precinct by precinct and look for those anomalies. And then within those blue areas, when you say it's very blue, what does that mean? And why is your person running? There's other reasons to run other than to win. You could be working to help the ticket up and down.
Great. The questions keep rolling in, so people want to keep hearing you talk. I don't know. So Morgan is talking about topic is college voting.
Yes.
How do you reach out to students who are conservatives but might be disenfranchised by either their school administration from coming out and sharing their views,
right,
or are just not interested in voting? So how do you get to those people? What are get out the vote tactics there?
That's hard. You should go to the Leadership Institute's Youth Leadership School, where you'll learn these techniques and tactics. But aside from that, the short answer is, there's an old saying, sometimes the best you can do is the best you can do. So you do the best that you can. That's a larger question of how do you engage apathetic voters? How do you re-engage disenfranchised voters? Well, those are hard things to do. And then the third part of that is how do you identify those who do not want to be identified? They may want to vote for your guy, but they're not going to stick a yard sign in their window. They're not going to come out. And when you interview them to ask them, they may just lie. They may say they're undecided. They may say they're voting for the other guy. Well, if they're doing that, you cannot identify them. I mean, there's no trick to that. But you can at least make your case to those people, and then just try to identify as many of them as you can. Those are all severe challenges. How do you get apathetic people to care more? What's in it for them? I think you have to appeal to them on that basis. College students are going to graduate. What's the job market going to look like? You just have to ask them quite simply, do you want to live in your parents' basement, never get married, never have the 3 children that what is your dream? What is your American dream? And I guarantee whatever they say, it's being dulled by the left. If your dream is married with children, young people are having to put off their American dreams because of the policies of the left. It's just very clear. And I think you need to talk that way to students and make them understand that they shouldn't be reacting emotionally, they should be acting rationally. And the fact is the job market stinks, and if you want to buy a house, you won't be able to until 10 years after your plan is. You want to be married? That's going to be delayed. Because that's delayed, you'll have fewer children. You'll have 1 instead of the 3 that you wanted. You won't be able to afford them because you'll be paying more taxes. You have to appeal to them on that basis as an adult. As far as people who are disenfranchised by the administration, that's why you're there. You're fighting the fight. But people who just won't want to be identified might be the biggest challenge. And that's
in most cases
somewhat insurmountable. I mean, I don't know how you...
In most cases, can a campaign reach out to campus groups that might be on campus to work with them? Like maybe there's a gun group or a pro-life group, in order to work with them to, identify voters to get them out to vote if they might be
Sure, but those clubs will be small compared to the overall population. But again, do what you can do.
Right. Every vote matters.
It does. It does. And you may only squeeze another 10 votes out of that campus. But if your guy wins by 6 votes, you'll be able to say, I won that election for that person. That's great. When you win a close election, everyone can say that, by the way. It's what I did won the election, and it's true. Those are fun to be involved in.
Right. We have time for one final question.
Sure.
From our audience, and then I'm going to give you the last word, and we'll close things out for today. So Chris from New York would like to know, and maybe you can answer this, or maybe you can't. We'll find out. What role does social media and digital play in get out the vote, if any at all?
It does play a role because it's voter contact, just like direct mail, just like phones, just like door to door. And so it is another way to connect with and contact voters. As interactive as you can make that will be to your advantage. But even if it's not interactive, it's important to be up there because you are persuading in those mediums. So I would put it right up there, although we didn't mention it, it's a great question. I would put it right up there with door-to-door, right up there with telephones. In fact, in New York City, it's the only way to contact voters because you can't get past those doormen. By the way, even if you live in the building, you're not allowed to go door-to-door. You can't say, well, I live here. No, you still can't go door to door. And people will complain. Not just if you're a conservative. That's why they live in those buildings, because they don't want to be bothered. And they sure don't want to be bothered by their neighbors. So social media and very important because it gives another dimension to your campaign, another technique to convey your message. But I'll tie this into my final comment. The final comment is your message still, we didn't talk about message, but your message is key. Because if you're firing on all cylinders, all of your voter contact, all of your interaction has to be consistent with the same message. So whether it's door-to-door, telephones, email, social media, direct mail, television, radio, that message needs to be consistent and constant. And so again, you do as much as you can, but if it's on the same theme, you'll be doing your campaign a lot of good. If it's disjointed and the person who's doing social media, he's doing one thing, and the person who's doing the mail is doing something else, and the TV guy has his theory about the message, the campaign needs to have a disciplined message coordinated by the manager.
And that all comes back to the plan from day
That's
one,
right.
which probably has gone out the window 4 to 8 times, but still.
But still, the general principle of that consistent message has to hold everything together.
Right.
And even within different issues, the thread of the theme of the messaging, that strategic message needs to be there.
Sure. Steve, I'm sure you could go on for hours longer, but
no, I think we're about done.
I think we'll leave it there.
No, sure.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in at home. This was an excellent conversation, and good news, it was recorded, so you can watch it later and send it to your friends, your family members later. And you do that by going to leadershipinstitute.org/activism-on-demand. Our next webinar will be in about 2 weeks, so stay tuned and watch your inboxes for details on when that will be. And with that, have a good night.